But we're here today in our worship service. That's what we call this. This is the worship service, the typical term for it. And we're here, and we come with certain expectations to sing a few songs, to have a prayer or two, to hear some preaching. We're going to take communion today, and then we go home. And so that kind of encompasses the worship service. But worship is holistic. It encompasses everything about us. It encompasses all of us. But worship also costs something. And when I say cost, in a lot of ways we're talking about the economic principle of opportunity cost. A yes to something is a no to something else. So on a basic level, it costs you maybe sleeping in today. It costs you watching something on television or going out for brunch or something like that. It costs you something that you had to say no to be here today. But worship costs something. And we can see how the world tries to shape us. And it spends an exorbitant amount of money trying to accomplish that, trying to shape us, trying to get us to worship these things. And maybe we don't use the word that we're trying to worship these things, but they're trying to get us to say, this is important, this is valuable, this is what your life is missing. And Disney World does a fantastic job at this. And Disney World is the most magical place on earth. But the most magical place on earth didn't get that way by accident. It got that way through intentionality, through a lot of effort by the park and the company, that they pump out specific smells, that they don't sell gum there to keep the park clean, that when they have a cast member like Snow White, that cast member can't talk to you as to distort the experience, and that cast member that's Snow White can't see another Snow White, so that you're continually in this illusion of this magical experience. But the problem with these types of things in the world is that you're always going to have to consume more to get the same satisfaction and the same fulfillment. So something like Disney World has to build bigger parks, and it costs more. It's more expensive for us and for them, and it's just more and more and more, and we consume. And that's how the world works. But one of the things about faith, particularly Christianity, is that worship repeats. Worship repeats itself constantly. And sometimes when we talk about things that repeat, it can be boring, mundane, or stale. And we have to be careful with anything, religious or otherwise. Those rituals that we have can become that. But just because it's repeating, just because it's common, doesn't mean it loses its effectiveness, doesn't mean it's no longer legitimate, doesn't mean that it's actually what we need. And part of it is we have to recognize when we come to Jesus and we worship Him, what's actually happening. Because sometimes we view worship as a partnership or an exchange. When I worship Jesus, it's not I'm giving something to Jesus so He gives something back to me. There's no quid pro quo. There's no transaction here. There's no I get something from this. Because if I worship Jesus to get something from this, I'm not really worshiping Jesus. I'm worshiping my own desires, my own satisfaction, my own pleasures, whatever that may be. If I'm doing something to get something from it, I'm worshiping myself instead. But see, worship is an offering. It's I'm coming to Jesus and saying, Jesus, I'm giving you myself. I'm giving you the praise you deserve. Now, oftentimes, Jesus responds. Jesus makes His presence known in new and fresh and tangible ways. But I don't worship Jesus to get something from it, because then it's not worshiping Jesus. It's just about me. But part of what worship does, when we're talking about Jesus, is that worship, it anticipates. It provides a foretaste of what is to come. Now, that can be a little difficult for us to wrap our minds around. You know, we talk about heaven sometimes, of this place where we're floating around on the clouds, playing harps, and just praising Jesus the whole time, which sounds really boring. And that's not something that's really exciting. But if we look at Luke chapter 2 and we see that the angel gives the message to the shepherds, and then the angel is joined by a vast host of others praising God and saying, glory to God in the highest and peace on earth to those with whom God is pleased. See, heaven is bursting at the seams. Heaven is constantly in the presence of God. The angels are constantly with God, but yet they still praise Him. That's how awesome God is. And so when we talk about worshiping, we need to remember how awesome this God is that we worship, and the fact that He's so awesome that it's never going to be boring. It's never going to be stale. It's never going to be something we're like, oh, I wish I could do something else. That's how powerful and awesome God is. So our worship is anticipating that. It's a foretaste of that. It's recognizing that there's a new reality to come in Jesus that we can begin to experience here and now. And so we worship. And we worship out of our heart's desire. Because as people, we are designed to worship something. We have passions that we seek. We have things that we go after. It's a matter of your choice. What do you worship? What do you spend your time on? What are the things in your life that are so valuable that you couldn't live without them? Because you are mastered by what you pursue. And maybe you can't necessarily have a great self-awareness now, but if you look back on your life 10, 20 years ago, what were you pursuing? And you can say, I was mastered by that pursuit. What were you actually chasing after? You know, we have things like happiness. We have things like money, health, a sports team, or a musical artist, political pursuits. We have all these things that we pursue. And those things can master us if we're not careful. And the Christmas story shows us this. And we're going to be in Matthew chapter 2 today. And this is about King Herod and the wise men. So we get to Matthew chapter 2, verse 1, and we find that Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the reign of King Herod. About that time, wise men from the east arrived in Jerusalem asking, where is the newborn King of the Jews? We saw his star as it rose, and we have come to worship him. With anybody or anything, it's important to make sure we get our bearings, that we understand, where am I right now? What is your setting? Because your setting is the area where you're familiar. It's the area you know. I've mentioned before my hometown of Potomac, Illinois, of 700 people. We don't use street names there. We don't use the actual names of things. We use names like, well, it's the big park or the little park. And that's how we talk about it. And so I can't tell you the names of the streets, but I can tell you how to get around the town. I am so immersed in that setting that for 18 years of my life, I lived there. And so I knew it. And so Jesus is not about knowing facts. It's not about knowing the highlights of, well, what are the street names in town? It's immersing yourself into Jesus so that you know it, so that you're consumed by it. Because when you're talking to somebody else about Jesus, the biggest issue is not that you are able to recite facts, but it's about you're able to show them who Jesus is in your life and to take them on an encounter with Jesus. That's what it means to worship Jesus in our life. But we have to, again, take an audit of our life of where am I now? Where am I now with Jesus? Because in this moment in Matthew chapter 2, we find that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. This was a real event, a real time in history. And as I said, worship repeats itself. Oftentimes, Scripture repeats itself in many ways. Scripture has some cyclical type concepts that run throughout it. There's a scholar, his name is Walter Brueggemann. He's one of the kind of biggest scholars right now, the last century or so. But he talks about, he was reading Scripture, and he realized that there's one story that repeats itself time and time and time again. And that story is that God has called His people to be His reflection. That those who are following God are called to reflect God into the world. That we as followers of Jesus are called to show the world who God is. The problem is that people fail time and time again. And God keeps calling His people back. Keep calling them to be His reflection. And so, but the question we have to answer, that has always been a question that needs to be answered, is how can we live as God's unique people in the midst of a world that is so contrary to His purposes? We look at the world, and we can bemoan the world and say the world doesn't love Jesus, or the world is living contrary to Jesus. That's not a new problem. That's not something that is new to us. This is how the world works. And we can see this with things like King Herod. King Herod was a very ruthless individual. He was a great leader in many ways, but he was a really terrible person in a lot of other ways. He killed people just because his reign was threatened. He killed countless people because of this. But that's how the world works. Maybe not as ruthless from a murdering standpoint as Herod, but in a dog-eat-dog world of how can I get ahead? How can I function? How can I be the one who comes out on top? And so these wise men come searching for Jesus. Now, one of the things about Jesus that is particularly Christmas time is the Advent season, which is 4 Sundays before Christmas, is when Advent starts, is the beginning of the liturgical year for the church. It's the beginning of the church calendar. And it stands in contrast with the worldly calendar that begins January 1st. But see, the fact of the matter is, every Advent season, we come back and we start with Jesus. It's this cyclical process because worship repeats itself. We come back to Jesus year after year after year. And part of what this does is it breaks us free from the world's 24/7, 365 days a year of we've got to achieve, we've got to perform, we've got to function. We come back to Jesus as a way of a reminder to reset ourselves to Him, to get back in rhythm with Him so that we are no longer in the rhythms of the world. Jesus restores our focus and recenters our hope on Him every year. But see, the world functions like Herod, because when Herod heard what the wise men were doing, he was deeply disturbed, as was everyone in Jerusalem. And so he met with the religious leaders and asked them where the Messiah was supposed to be born. And they said, in Bethlehem in Judea, for this is what the prophet wrote. And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not least among the ruling cities of Judah. For a ruler will come from you who will be a shepherd to my people Israel. The world was threatened. Herod was threatened. And if we're honest, we have similarities with Herod because we get threatened. With Jesus, this is what I want to do. I don't want to change. I don't want to adjust. I don't want to do these things. I don't want to have my life turned upside down. And so maybe we don't phrase it this way or articulate it like this, but we make demands. When we come to Jesus, Jesus, I'll do this if you do this. I'll make this concession over here, Jesus, but I'm not going to like it, and I better get something payback for it later. See, we like to assert control with Jesus, with anything. We like to assert control. We like our say to have some clout and to get our way. But I've heard it said that we can understand God's wisdom like a 3-year-old. In the sense of, we know it's there, but we can't really fully comprehend it. We can talk about the wisdom of God, or even things like the holiness and majesty of God, the power of God. We can claim these things. We can kind of start to understand them by the fact that we know they're there, but we can't fully understand them. So sometimes we're suspicious. Sometimes we're hesitant. But this brings back to worship. What you worship will master you. The things you pursue will master you. But we have to be careful to make sure that we worship the right things. Reminds me of the government class or civics class versus the Pledge of Allegiance. You know, most schools require students to take some type of government class before they graduate. But those classes don't really shape them. They give them a bit of information. But every day you stand up and you say the pledge. And we have that ingrained in us. Not that love of country is wrong, but things like the pledge every day, national anthem before every sporting event, it shapes us. It moves us to believe, hey, we love this country. And again, there's nothing wrong with this. But worshiping Jesus and being shaped by Jesus is not about this emotional high. Oh, I feel really, really awesome about this. That's not what our worship is about. Our worship is about being shaped by Jesus, about being formed by Him. Because if our goal here today was for me to give you information, we didn't have to be here today. I could have emailed you something. I could have sent you a link to some great other pastor that can speak better than I can. I could have sent you, mailed you a letter or something like that. But we're here not because we need information, and maybe we do need information, but we're here first and foremost, be formed and shaped by Jesus. And so as Herod shows us, we may not have all the answers, but a good leader knows how to get answers. How do we do this? And so maybe we come here today and we say, how does Jesus shape us? Are we accomplishing what we're hoping to? Do these rituals and practices actually shape us in what we want? Is He making us grateful followers of Him? Or are we just consumers? Are we just getting something from Jesus? Now, the religious leaders quote from Micah chapter 2 about the Messiah was supposed to be born in Bethlehem. It's always interesting, the fact of the religious leaders knew that people were saying the Messiah was born. They knew He's supposed to be born in Bethlehem, but they still seemed to miss it. They didn't actually go and they didn't seek Jesus. But what we find in Jesus is the necessity of the cross. And the cross is necessary because we as humanity have failed in this mission that God has given us to reflect His image. We're not doing that. We're seeking our own desires. We're seeking our own self. We're worshiping ourselves and what we want. And so the necessity of the cross is real because we have failed at the mission to be the bearer images of God. And so Jesus came. But worship responds to that. Worship responds for us to be the people that bear God's image. So we came here today worshiping Jesus, offering ourselves to Him, and saying, Jesus, we need you to shape us so that we can go out in this world and reflect you. Not for us. It's not about us getting anything from it, but it's about us accepting the mission God has given us to enter into this new reality, to anticipate the coming of Jesus and the newness that will come from that, and to go out into this world and establish this newness that Jesus has. But I talked about how worship costs us something. But the reality is salvation can't be bought, but it will cost you everything. If you want to receive the saving grace of Jesus Christ, there's nothing you can do to earn it. But in order for you to receive it, you have to give Jesus your everything. And it's not about a transaction. It's about saying, Jesus, there's nothing else worth pursuing except you. But we're going to have things that try to trick us, things that try to trip us up, things that try to get us off track, which is exactly what Herod does to the wise men. Because he met with them in secret and he learned from them the time when the star first appeared. And he told them, go to Bethlehem and search carefully for this child so that I may go worship him too. See, Herod had this secret meeting. He was trying to not reveal all of his cards, to keep his motives hidden. And so he lied. Now, we don't know much about the wise men. They may have been pretty shrewd. They may be like, we've heard about Herod. I doubt that he actually wants to go worship this newborn king. I doubt that he actually wants to do this. So they may have been skeptical, but even whether they were or not, it's not the point. Because the world's going to try to deceive us like this. And this is not to speak derogatory towards the world. The world says what they have is what we need. It's in contrast to Jesus. It competes with Jesus. So if we want to be shaped by Jesus, we have to continually come back to Him. And sometimes that can be really hard, just like learning a new skill, learning a new language, learning to type, learning to play an instrument. It takes a lot of concentration right at the beginning. But then as you get better at it, at that new skill, it becomes more and more natural part of who you are. As a follower of Jesus, it can be really, really difficult. It takes a lot of concentration early on. But then as you follow Him more and more, it becomes part of who you are. Now, we have to be careful that we're making sure we're going in the correct direction. Because we can create habits for Jesus that don't actually honor Jesus. These habits that we form become automatic. And if we have automatic habits that don't honor Jesus, that's really, really hard to break. But the reality is we're pursuing something. We're going to be shaped by something. We're going to allow something to impact who we are, which is why we have to be really careful to make sure Jesus is the thing that we're following. But see, after the wise men had this meeting with Herod, they continued on their way, and the star they had seen in the east guided them to Bethlehem. It went ahead of them and stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were filled with joy. They entered the house and saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasure chest and brought him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Now, one of the questions we can always ask with the wise men is, why did they stop in Jerusalem? And were they distracted? Jerusalem was the capital city, so it makes sense for the king to come there, and maybe that was why they just naturally went there. Were they distracted because, well, it's the capital city, and let's quit following the star, this is close enough? Was this part of God's plan? And we're not going to get to this today, but a lot of atrocity happened because Herod was made aware of what was going on. A lot of boys under the age of 2 around the area of Bethlehem were killed because of this interaction. But a lot of times we can get distracted. We can get off course. We can land in the wrong place. But one of the things we don't have to worry about is that our faith, following Jesus, is not about you achieving something. Many of you are familiar with Tim Keller, recently passed away, pastor in New York. But he said that Christianity is the one religion, the one worldview where our identity is not achieved, it is received. When, as a follower of Jesus, your identity is not something you have because you accomplished something. It's not as though you did all these good works or you did all these things and so that now you can be considered a follower of Jesus. It's to receive the identity in Jesus. You just come to Jesus and say, Jesus, I want to be your follower. Now, there are good works that we have to do, that are called to do. We are called to be the light of the world, the salt of the earth. We're called to go out into this world and make a difference, but that comes after we've received this new identity in Jesus. That new identity inspires us to go out into the world to do this. See, no matter where you are in your relationship with Jesus, no matter where you are in your faith journey, Jesus doesn't say you have to accomplish these things before you can be part of the club. He says, I just want you to come to me. I want to give you this new identity. There's no prerequisites. There's nothing you have to do in order to qualify. You just have to come to me. But this is about being intentional. It's about making sure we are shaped by the right things. Because we look at God's people throughout Scripture, how they failed to bear God's image, to reflect God to the world. And we look at things like prophecies in the book of Daniel, and it basically says, if you don't remain faithful to God, it talks about how all the bad things are going to happen from that. But what really we get to in this is that if God's people allow their desires to be shaped by the culture, by the rulers of this world, by the influences of this world, their children are going to do the same thing. And that's a dangerous reality. And while as parents shouldn't just make their decisions based on, well, how is this going to impact my kids? Right? Parents, adults, we still need to make decisions of, What does Jesus want me to do just because I'm a follower of Jesus, not because of the other roles and responsibilities I have? But when we have parents who are being shaped by the culture, their kids are also going to be shaped by the culture. When Christians are being shaped by the culture, other Christians are going to start being shaped by the culture. And we become enslaved by our desires. And whether we like it or not, our desires enslave. What we run after, what we long for, what we want to receive will master us. Some of you can't function in the morning until you have a cup of coffee. Yeah, you say amen. That desire masters you. And I'm not saying you have to give up coffee. That's not the point. But we recognize that we allow things into our life that influence us. And if we're not careful, we will be mastered by those things. Now, something like coffee or food, whatever that may be, we don't have to walk around being paranoid about things. But regardless of what it is, we have to ask ourselves, if Jesus calls me to give this up, will I do it? Because if I won't, then I'm being mastered by that, and I'm not being mastered by Jesus. So regardless of what that may be, our desires can enslave us. So we have to choose Jesus or choose something else. But we think about the wise men. And they come to this house, they enter it, they see the child with his mother, and they bow down and then they worship him. That was their first instinct. Their first instinct was to worship Jesus. How do you approach Jesus? Sometimes we can approach Jesus in all sorts of different attitudes. We can approach Jesus with entitlement or arrogance. We can approach Jesus begrudgingly. We can approach Jesus with suspicion. We can approach Jesus with so many different ways, so many different reasons. And we talk about how Jesus is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. But Jesus calls his followers to first and foremost is to identify as a follower of Jesus. We don't put any other adjective in front of that. I am a Christian. I'm not a male Christian. I'm not a white Christian. I'm a Christian. I'm a follower of Jesus. And now sometimes I could be, I'm a St. Louis Cardinals fan who is a follower of Jesus, right? Right now, no, that seems ridiculous, right? Some of you might think it's ridiculous I'm a St. Louis Cardinals fan, but we like to put adjectives in front of that sometimes. I'm a follower of Jesus. I'm a Christian. That defines me. I don't need anything else in my life to define me other than that. No matter how meaningful, no matter how trivial, we must protect our identity in Jesus. Because you know what the alternative is? It's to assimilate to the culture. To allow the culture to influence us. And if the culture shapes our desires, then our desires are being shaped contrary to Jesus. So we have to be very careful about that. But as we think about how worship costs us something, the Magi, the wise men, actually gave Jesus gifts. They opened their treasure chest and gave him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Odd gifts. I mean, gold we use today. Frankincense and myrrh have applications in certain ways, medicine, ointment, that type of stuff. But those things were very costly in that time. And we don't know the quantity of the gift, of how much gold was there, but gold is expensive, and it costs them something. And worship costs. Worship requires sacrifice. But what we tend to do in our very comfortable setting, climate-controlled, country where nobody feared persecution, being thrown in jail because they came here today. Well, we talk about the sacrifices we make. Well, I didn't like that song today, but I still tried to look happy. That's not sacrifice. It's not. And regardless if you like the songs or not, you can have a preference. It's not about suppressing our preferences, but what does it mean to sacrifice for Jesus? Okay, you could have slept in an extra hour today. Is that a real sacrifice? Now, it is a sacrifice, don't get me wrong. You could have done other things, so you sacrifice those other things for this. And I don't want to be too over dramatic, and there's persecuted church in the world where people really fear imprisonment or even death for believing in Jesus. Well, you don't need just to pursue being persecuted. That's not necessarily worship either. But what does it mean for you to actually sacrifice for Jesus? How do you submit to Jesus? How do you serve others? How do you put yourself on the back burner for Jesus? Because if we don't forsake our worldly desires, we're going to be shaped by our worldly desires. We're going to be influenced by them. And we are designed to worship. We're designed to pursue something. We're designed to achieve. We're designed to grow. And anything short of worshiping God with those desires is idolatry. We're worshiping something else. Because if we don't worship God, we'll find something else to worship. Oftentimes, it comes back to worshiping ourselves, worshiping our pleasures, our needs, our wants. Well, what's best for me? And the world understands this. The world understands that you are really, really important. That your preferences, your desires, your wants are really important. And so the way it tries to influence us is very holistic. It's about all of us. And so when we go to things like sporting events or the mall or the movie theater, it's all encompassing. They often incorporate all of our senses. You walk into the movie theater and right away you smell the popcorn. And then maybe you get the popcorn, you taste the popcorn. And that's part of the experience. You hear the sounds, you hear the popcorn popping, you hear people at the register, you hear the movie with the 47 speaker surround sound system. You see this humongous screen and all the pictures and the lights. And then you sit in this seat. And now we're getting a little snooty about it. We remember how the seats feel at the movie theater. Ooh, those were padded and they reclined. They had double armrests so you didn't have to share with the person next to you. And that's part of the experience in the movie theater saying, this is what your life has been missing. And so you want to come back. And it's a different movie the next time often, but you go back and back. And whether it's the movie theater, whether it's the sports arena, whether it's the concert hall, wherever it is, we have these entertainment things that try to shape us and say, this is what your life is missing. So the question we have to ask ourselves, what is my life missing? What does my life need? Because eventually the time came for the wise men to leave. Now they returned home by another route, for God warned them in a dream not to return to King Herod. But eventually they had to leave. God protected them, but they had to leave. So I come back to ask yourself to take an audit of yourself. Where are you in your journey with Jesus? Maybe you're on a journey with Jesus your whole life, and you just love Jesus. Maybe you're not really sure. I don't know. I don't not believe in Jesus. Or maybe you're somewhere in between. But the point is not to compare yourself with someone else. And so, where am I now? Find your starting point. Because one of the things I'm reminded of is that Jesus calls his followers to love. He calls all his followers to love each other, to love him. We're supposed to love God with everything we have. We're supposed to love our neighbor as ourselves. But when we fail to love, it reveals our brokenness. And that's a real easy point. When people don't love, it shows how broken they are. But Jesus was broken to heal us. He was broken so that we could be restored. He was broken so that we could love in the way that he designed for us to love. But our focus is not, what does God want me to do? Our focus needs to be on who has God called me to be? Who does God want me to be? Because remember, our identity is not something that we achieve. It's not because I accomplished these things, I'm now part of Jesus' club. It's Jesus gives me himself, gives me this new identity, and then from that, he helps me be the person he's called me to be. But with the wise men, one of the things about their story is we don't know how it ends. There's just these 12 verses where the wise men are found. And it says they returned home. They went back home. Now, did they go back home and follow Jesus faithfully all of their lives? Maybe. Did they return home and just say, you know what, we had a pretty good experience. Back to normal. That was something that we'll remember, but it's not something that's going to shape us. Because oftentimes I feel a lot of people have that same story with Jesus. Have an encounter with Jesus every once in a while. But then we just go back to normal. I fulfill this religious obligation, whatever that may be. And sometimes those religious obligations can be every week. There are people who every week come and, you know what, I'm going to have this encounter with Jesus, or I'm going to be here where we talk about Jesus, but then I'm going to go to live my life however I want after that. That's not what Jesus wants for us. That's not what it means to follow Jesus. And I say that not in a condemning way, but in a way that says Jesus wants more for you. Because if we only come to Jesus every once in a while and say, oh, I'm doing a check-in. I'm just feeling better about myself. I'm fulfilling this obligation. Whether it's once a week, once a year, once a decade, whatever it is, we're going to leave dissatisfied. We're going to leave unfulfilled. But the point is not that you have it all figured out. Jesus doesn't say you have to have it figured out before you come to me. He says just come to me. Because you know what? Before we can spew all this theological jargon, we identify Jesus as something worth pursuing. See, the issue is not that we have figured Jesus out, but that we have realized that Jesus is worth pursuing. That's what we have to figure out. That's what we have to make sure we recognize. So we ask ourselves, am I being shaped by the culture or am I being shaped by Jesus? The last illustration that I've shared previously, it's like a car. That when you're in a car and it's driving, you are one with the car. The car goes forward, you go forward. The car goes backwards, you go backwards. The car goes to the right or to the left, you go to the right or to the left. You are one with the car. But when we're talking about Jesus, we have to remember that we're not actually driving the car. That we're just in the car. Jesus has invited us to be in the car, to be one with Him. Now, there are some people that want to drive and say, Jesus, I'll be in the car, but I've got to have control. And there are also people that say, you know, I don't want to get in the car, but I know everything about the car. If it's broken, I can fix the car. I can tell you what to do, how to do it. I can know all these facts about Jesus, but I don't actually want to follow Jesus. See, those are some of the things that we naturally do. We want to know a lot about Jesus, but we don't want Jesus to change us. We'll come to Jesus, but we've got to be in control. So we have to decide for ourselves. Are we going to have an encounter with Jesus where we come to Him, and then when it's time to leave, we just go back to life as normal? Or are we going to come to Jesus and say, Jesus, I want you to shape me. I want you to form me. I don't have it all figured out, but I have figured out that you are worth pursuing. That's the question we have to ask. Because we're here worshiping Jesus. We're here being shaped and formed by Jesus. Are we actually letting Him do that? Or are we still in control? Are we still the one who's controlling if we're going left or right? Or are we allowing Jesus to do that? There's going to be dangers along the way. There's going to be things that get in the way. There's going to be obstacles. There's going to be problems. There's going to be things that try to distract us. But we have to choose for ourselves what we're going to do with that. We have to choose for ourselves if that, even if we get off course, do I still want to come back to Jesus? Because we're going to get off course. We're going to stumble. We're going to fall. But Jesus says, I want you. Just come to me. It's not about what you can achieve. Just receive me. That's what Jesus asks us to do. And Jesus showed us his love, showed us that he wants us to come to him, shows us that he wants to restore us to God through his life, through his death, and through his resurrection.